Hello, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, an influential philosopher, once said, and I quote, "Man is born free and everywhere he is in chains." This quote today will not be talking about man, but this quote will be attributed to the continent of Africa. Most countries in Africa got their independence from the colonial masters in the 50s and in the 60s, and one would expect that given the abundant natural and human resources that abounds in Africa, one would expect that Africa would have attained a level of development that will be equated to what is obtainable in Europe today. But that's not the case. Africa has become a breeding ground for poverty, for all manner of criminality, underdevelopment, impoverishment. Anything you want to think about, it's now Africa has become a centerpiece of all of this, despite all the resources that abound in Africa. And one would say that the resources in Africa has really helped to develop what you have in the West today. And one will ask, how come these resources are not used to develop Africa? So let's have Africa, like Europe, and because these, has made a lot of Africans that died on the quest of traveling to get the proverbial green pastures in Europe, because Africa, despite having had independence over 60 years ago, is still not a place where the young people feel their dreams can be attained, their dreams can be achieved. You see, and you'll be wondering, with all the resources in Africa that used by a lot of industries in Europe, one would expect that all of these, given what would have accrued from these resources, would have helped to develop Africa. And there's this argument that, the African state is corrupt, and that's why we've not been able to harness what we have internally. But we forget to ask a particular question. If you say Africans or the African leaders are corrupt, who aids the African leaders in this corruption? It is still the West. They help the African leaders to launder these funds into these countries in Europe. And you can imagine, for example, let's look at Paul Biya, the president of Cameroon. He has not been, available for a long time. Cameroonians don't even see him, and he lives in one of these developed countries. So something that you cannot accept in your country, but you want other people, you allow it happen elsewhere and you indulge it. So the corruption that we see perpetrated by African leaders would have been successful if they do not have, collaborations with the West. There's this argument that the African leaders do not have what it takes to develop the country, but because the resources in Africa, they have been siphoned using puppets as leaders in Africa. And when will Africa be free? Because it appears there's independence, but Africa is not free. There's still a lot of meddling in the affairs, in African countries. Because how do you explain the fact that in most developed countries that have offices for African affairs? That means Africa is merely treated in the foreign affairs just like an entity in the hands of these so-called powerful countries. Because how can you have an office for African affairs? Africa is treated just like every other corporation, not as a country that it should be. That's why we have every African European summit, China's African summit. What is this about Africa? They should allow Africa to develop. And when will Africa be free? Because how do you explain that America has a stake, a good percentage, in the African Development Bank? So that means some of the fundings for the African Development comes from the US. That means still exercising, control over what happens in Africa. And one of the essence of this video is every time African leaders have called for, Let's have African unity. Let us unite, because without a united Africa, we cannot break entirely from the caprices of the West, from World Bank, from IMF. Look at what IMF is doing in Nigeria, putting pressure on the government to remove subsidies. Look at poverty everywhere in Nigeria, and even the World Bank vice president saying it will take another 10-15 years, of sustaining this level of IMF economic policy for Africa, for Nigeria to get it right. You can imagine the number of people that will die within the 10-15 years, just 1 year or 2 years into the implementation of the IMF policy in Nigeria, and Nigerians are facing untold hardship. And anytime leaders in the past have called for African unity, a stronger Africa, to ensure that Africa break completely from the caprices of the Western ideology, they've always ended up dead. How do we explain the death of Thomas Sankara? How do we explain the death of Mobutu Sese Seko? How do we explain the death of Kwame Nkrumah? How do you explain the death of Muammar Gaddafi? How do you explain the death of Murtala Mohammed? How do you explain the death of Joseph Kabila? How do you explain all of these African leaders who have been killed while conversing for the greater African unity, to break from the West, to ensure more nationalism, to ensure indigenization, and to ensure that Africa, attain its potential given the enormous resources that abound in Africa? Because the African leaders we have now are the ones who have sold Africa. They've sold Africa to the West. You have these leaders who have continued to put Africa on the path of poverty. These leaders have sold African resources to the West. These leaders, all because they just want to be president. We have so many of them. We have them in Nigeria, in Equatorial Guinea. We have them in Togo. We have them everywhere. These leaders, they are more accountable to the West, the G20 countries, than the people of Africa. They are ready to even sell more Africans to get these people, because Africa has to be united. We have to ensure that our brothers and sisters stop crossing the Atlantic Ocean just to come and get the green pasture in Africa. Africa must be united. We have to get Africa united. We have to ensure that Africa is united so we can use the resources that abound in Africa to develop Africa for Africans. Please don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. You can follow me on Instagram, on TikTok, and on Facebook, and of course my WhatsApp channel that's shown on your screen. And you can give us insight on how you think we can make Africa great again and push all these leaders out to ensure that Africa remains the greatest. Thank you.